Russia just crossed a threshold that military analysts are calling catastrophic. In December 2025 alone, Ukrainian forces struck over 33,000 Russian troops with drones, more personnel losses in a single month than many armies suffer in entire wars. And for the first time since this invasion began, Russia is recruiting fewer soldiers than it's losing on the battlefield. The math that was supposed to guarantee Moscow's victory has fundamentally broken down. I'm Sophie Hart, and you're watching Sophie Hart Reports. If you want to understand how drone warfare is reshaping modern military power, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This story reveals something bigger than just one conflict. It's about how technology is rewriting the rules of war itself. What we're witnessing in Ukraine isn't just another chapter in an ongoing conflict. It's a turning point. For nearly 3 years, Russia has thrown waves of soldiers at Ukrainian defenses, banking on a simple calculation. With a population 4 times larger than Ukraine's, Moscow could simply outlast Kiev through sheer numbers. That strategy is now collapsing under the weight of unprecedented casualties and a weapon system that's more effective than anyone predicted: drones. To understand why Russia's front lines are fracturing, we need to look at the numbers that the Kremlin doesn't want you to see. 2025 marked the bloodiest year yet for Russian forces in Ukraine. According to Ukrainian military assessments, Russia suffered approximately 420,000 casualties over those 12 months, a figure that includes soldiers killed, wounded, and missing. That's more than 1,000 Russian service members becoming casualties every single day. To put that in perspective, the entire Soviet war in Afghanistan over 10 years resulted in roughly 15,000 deaths. Russia is approaching that number in casualties every 2 weeks of fighting in Ukraine. The Center for Strategic and International Studies released analysis in early 2026 showing that Russia's total casualties since the invasion began have now reached approximately 1.2 million. Of those, between 275,000 and 325,000 are estimated to be fatalities. These aren't just statistics. Each number represents a Russian soldier who won't return home. Independent verification by BBC Russian and Mediazona has confirmed over 152,000 Russian deaths by name as of late 2025, though the actual toll is certainly higher since many deaths go unreported or unverified. What makes these losses particularly striking is what Russia has gained in exchange. Despite this enormous blood price, Russian forces captured just 6,640 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2025, less than 1% of Ukraine's total land area. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky pointed out that this territorial gain cost Russia roughly 420,000 casualties. That's an exchange rate of approximately 63 casualties for every square kilometer gained. No modern military power has sustained losses at this scale while making such limited territorial progress. The weapon driving these catastrophic Russian losses is something that barely existed in military doctrine a decade ago: small, inexpensive drones. In 2025, Ukrainian forces deployed drones at a scale never before seen in modern warfare. According to Ukraine's defense ministry, Ukrainian drones conducted over 819,000 confirmed strikes throughout the year. Each strike was verified by video footage, making these among the most documented military operations in history. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov revealed that drones struck approximately 240,000 Russian soldiers in 2025. In December alone, Ukrainian drones hit 33,019 Russian personnel, a monthly record. Major Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, emphasized that every one of these strikes was confirmed through drone video, leaving no room for exaggeration. These aren't estimates or projections. They're verified kills and hits captured on camera. The effectiveness of drones has fundamentally changed how casualties occur on the battlefield. According to military.com and multiple defense analysts, approximately 70 to 75% of all Russian casualties in 2025 were attributed to drone strikes. This represents a complete shift from traditional warfare, where artillery typically caused the majority of casualties. Drones offer something artillery cannot: precision. An artillery shell might land near a target and cause injuries through shrapnel. A first-person view drone flies directly into its target, dramatically increasing the likelihood of a fatal strike. Ukraine's drone production scaled up massively during 2025. The country aimed to produce at least 2.5 million drones, with capacity potentially reaching 4.5 million by year's end. This industrial mobilization created what Ukrainian forces call a drone wall, a persistent aerial threat that makes movement across open terrain extremely dangerous for Russian forces. Every Russian unit trying to advance, evacuate wounded, or resupply has to contend with the possibility of drones overhead. While casualties mounted, Russia struggled to maintain the flow of new recruits needed to sustain its offensive operations. Kirilo Budanov, chief of Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, stated that Russia set a mobilization target of 409,000 recruits for 2026. This was roughly the same as the 403,000 Russia aimed to recruit in 2025, which it managed to meet by early December. Russian Deputy Defense Council Chairman Dmitry Medvedev later confirmed that approximately 422,704 people signed military contracts in 2025, though this represented a 6% decrease from 2024's figure of around 450,000. The mathematics here reveal Russia's fundamental problem, with recruitment averaging around 30 to 35,000 soldiers per month, and December 2025 seeing over 33,000 Russian personnel struck by Ukrainian drones alone. Russia reached a tipping point. For the first time since the invasion began, Russian losses in a single month nearly equaled or exceeded the country's monthly recruitment capacity. Ukrainian General Oleksandr Syrsky noted this milestone, explaining that the effective size of Russia's military force in Ukraine is no longer growing. Russia has tried to address recruitment shortfalls through financial incentives. Regional signing bonuses for military contracts have skyrocketed, with some regions offering up to 3 million rubles, approximately $25,000 or more. Research by Janis Klug from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs calculated that Russian federal and regional governments are spending approximately 2 billion rubles per day, about $21.5 million, just on enlistment bonuses. These payments have increased nearly fivefold since April 2024. Despite these massive incentives, recruitment appears to be plateauing or even declining slightly. The economic strain on regional budgets is visible, with several regions cutting their bonus amounts in late 2025 as they struggle to balance books. Moscow faces a dilemma: either increase incentives even further, straining an economy already under pressure from sanctions and military spending, or accept that recruitment cannot keep pace with losses. Perhaps the most alarming indicator of Russia's battlefield difficulties is the dramatic shift in its killed-to-wounded ratio. In traditional warfare, military forces typically see 1 death for every 3 soldiers wounded, a ratio based on World War II averages. Modern militaries with good training and medical support often achieve even better ratios. The United States, for example, saw roughly 1 death for every 10 wounded during operations in Afghanistan. Russia's ratio has moved in the opposite direction. According to analysis by the Institute for the Study of War, which examined leaked Russian military data published by Ukraine's I Want to Live project, Russia's killed-to-wounded ratio deteriorated dramatically in 2025. By mid-year, the ratio stood at approximately 1 soldier killed for every 1.3 wounded. This is abnormally high by any military standard. It means that Russian soldiers struck on the battlefield are nearly as likely to die as to survive with injuries. The leaked data covering January through August 2025 showed that of Russia's 281,550 casualties during those months, 86,744 were killed, while 158,529 were wounded. This works out to roughly 30% fatalities among total casualties, far higher than what would be expected with proper battlefield medical care and evacuation. ISW analysts pointed to this ratio as evidence of systematic failures in Russian battlefield medicine and casualty evacuation. What's driving this deadly ratio? Multiple factors are at work. First, drones are more lethal than artillery. While artillery shrapnel can cause survivable wounds, a drone's explosive payload detonating on target leaves less room for survival. Second, the drone-saturated battlefield makes casualty evacuation extremely dangerous. Russian medical teams cannot safely reach wounded soldiers when Ukrainian reconnaissance drones are constantly monitoring the battlefield, and strike drones can respond within minutes. And third, reports from Ukrainian forces and Russian soldiers themselves indicate that evacuation efforts are often abandoned entirely due to the risk involved. The concept of the golden hour in military medicine holds that wounded soldiers need evacuation to proper medical care within 60 minutes of injury to maximize survival chances. Ukrainian drones have effectively destroyed this principle for Russian forces. Drones create what military analysts call kill zones, areas where any movement draws immediate strikes. Russian evacuation teams face an impossible choice: rush to help wounded comrades and risk becoming casualties themselves, or wait for a break in Ukrainian drone coverage that may never come. Reports from the battlefield paint a grim picture. In July 2024, independent Russian outlet Meduza quoted Russian military doctors saying that soldiers who could have been saved were instead dying in ditches because evacuation teams couldn't reach them safely. One Ukrainian officer, Staff Sergeant Kirilo Duchko of the 13th Operational Brigade, told media in August 2024, "The enemy does not take away its killed personnel. They are lying in the middle of an open field. The Russians do not even evacuate their wounded. The wounded are either dying themselves or Ukrainian forces are helping them." This abandonment of wounded soldiers appears to be a systematic problem rather than isolated incidents. Ukrainian forces occupying parts of Russia's Kursk Oblast in 2025 encountered civilians who had been wounded by Russian shelling of occupied settlements. One woman named Ludmila, interviewed by the Washington Post, explained how Ukrainian soldiers pulled her from rubble after a Russian airstrike collapsed her house. In her words, "If there had not been Ukrainian soldiers there, we do not know what would have happened to us." The fact that Russian civilians in occupied territory stood better chances of receiving aid from Ukrainian forces than Russian soldiers on the battlefield speaks volumes about the state of Russian military medicine. Russia's infiltration tactics in 2025 made evacuation even more difficult. Russian forces increasingly relied on small units infiltrating Ukrainian-held settlements without heavy armor support. These soldiers operating behind Ukrainian lines had virtually no chance of medical evacuation if wounded. They were expected to hold positions until reinforcements arrived, reinforcements that often never came. If these infiltrators were wounded, their only hope was that Ukrainian forces would capture rather than kill them. Russia's military strategy throughout 2025 relied heavily on what analysts call attritional warfare, using numerical superiority to overwhelm defensive positions through repeated assaults. This approach assumes that you can afford to lose more soldiers than your opponent and that constant pressure will eventually break their lines. For this strategy to work, recruitment must exceed losses. In 2025, that equation failed. The central grouping of Russian forces responsible for the Pokrovsk direction in eastern Ukraine provides a case study in how costly these tactics have become. According to the leaked data analyzed by ISW, this grouping lost 43,709 killed, missing, or captured, plus another 52,865 wounded between January and August 2025, nearly 97,000 total casualties in 8 months. This represented roughly 34% of all Russian losses during that period. What did Russia gain for these catastrophic losses in this single sector? Despite months of fighting and tens of thousands of casualties, Russian forces failed to capture Pokrovsk, Mirnohrad, Novopavlivka, or Drushkivka. The battle for Pokrovsk continued through the end of 2025 without Russian forces achieving their objective. Meanwhile, Ukrainian drone units systematically targeted Russian concentrations attempting to mass for assaults, destroying force cohesion before attacks could even begin. The northern grouping of forces faced similar challenges, tasked with creating buffer zones in Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts while also responding to Ukraine's Kursk offensive. This grouping lost 53,572 troops, according to the same leaked data. These losses came from operations that largely failed to achieve strategic objectives. Ukraine maintained its hold on portions of Kursk Oblast, and Russian attempts to push back Ukrainian forces from border areas made minimal progress relative to the casualties incurred. Russia's manpower crisis exists alongside an equally serious equipment problem. CSIS analysis from August 2025 showed that since January 2024, Russia lost approximately 1,149 armored fighting vehicles, 3,098 infantry fighting vehicles, 300 self-propelled artillery pieces, and 1,865 tanks. These losses occurred despite Russia drawing heavily on Soviet-era stockpiles of equipment. The attrition ratio heavily favors Ukraine. Depending on the type of equipment and time period examined, Russian equipment losses run between 2-to-1 and 5-to-1 compared to Ukrainian losses. This disparity exists because Ukrainian forces have adopted defensive tactics that maximize the effectiveness of anti-tank weapons and drones while minimizing exposure of their own armor. Russian forces committed to offensive operations must move their vehicles across open ground under constant surveillance and fire. The heavy use of drones has made traditional armored assaults extremely costly. Military.com reported that massed armored vehicle attacks, once Russia's go-to tactic, have stalled or even shrunk in 2025. The reason is straightforward. Drones can track and target armored vehicles more effectively than infantry. A column of tanks crossing open terrain is easily spotted by reconnaissance drones, which can then vector and strike drones or artillery. This has forced Russia to rely more heavily on infantry assaults by small groups of soldiers, the same tactics that are producing such high casualty rates. Ukraine has also used drones to strike deep into Russian territory, targeting military air bases and oil refineries. The Security Service of Ukraine confirmed that its Alpha unit destroyed 15 Russian aircraft at 5 air bases in 2025 through long-range drone strikes, causing over $1 billion in estimated damage. These strikes on fixed installations demonstrate how drones have extended Ukraine's reach far beyond the immediate battlefield, threatening Russian assets that would once have been considered safely in the rear. Sustaining casualties at this rate carries enormous economic costs beyond just recruitment bonuses. Every Russian soldier killed or catastrophically wounded represents not just a human loss, but also an economic one. These are predominantly men of working age, many from economically depressed regions who are removed from the labor force. Meanwhile, the costs of supporting wounded veterans, paying death benefits, and providing for families of the dead mount steadily. Russia's economy is heavily skewed toward military production. The defense sector accounts for much of the country's economic growth, according to the Moscow Times reporting. This creates an unsustainable cycle. The economy grows because of war production, but that production supports a war that's destroying human capital and equipment faster than they can be replaced. Regional budgets are under particular strain, with many regions spending large portions of their revenues on recruitment incentives while also facing declining tax receipts from struggling businesses. The long-term economic impact of losing hundreds of thousands of men will reshape Russia for decades. These casualties are disproportionately drawn from rural areas and ethnic minority regions, according to BBC and Mediazona analysis. The republics of Bashkortostan and Tatarstan, plus Sverdlovsk region, recorded the highest numbers of confirmed fatalities, with 7,643, 6,599, and 5,386 deaths, respectively. Moscow, despite being Russia's largest city, recorded only 4,520 deaths, reflecting how the war's burden falls unevenly across Russian society. Ukraine's effective use of drones in 2025 is forcing military establishments worldwide to reconsider how wars will be fought in the future. The U.S. Army has explicitly stated that it's rewriting battle doctrine based on lessons from Ukraine. War Secretary Pete Hegseth issued a directive in July 2025 ordering every Army squad to be equipped with unmanned systems by the end of 2026. Army Chief of Staff General Randy George told Congress that technology is changing too rapidly to stick with large programs that take years to develop. The transformation goes beyond just adding drones to existing units. The U.S. Army is reorganizing infantry battalions to fight drone-first battles, using unmanned systems to find and kill enemies before traditional ground forces make contact. Tank tactics are being rethought, with tanks providing firepower from defended positions rather than spearheading attacks. Even procurement systems are being overhauled, with the Army expecting to domestically produce upward of 10,000 small drones per month starting in 2026. European NATO allies are paying equally close attention. In April 2025, French Chief of Staff General Pierre Schill acknowledged that drone warfare has relativized the strength of armored forces, with fronts increasingly static and maneuvers slowed. He called on France's cavalry arm to reinvent itself for this new reality. The UK signed a deal with Ukraine in October to jointly produce the Octopus 100 interceptor drone, recognizing that drone defense will be as important as drone offense in future conflicts. What makes Ukraine's drone success particularly significant is the economics involved. First-person view drones cost hundreds or low thousands of dollars each. The targets they destroy, tanks, artillery systems, and trained soldiers, cost exponentially more to produce and train. This cost asymmetry is similar to how anti-ship missiles changed naval warfare by threatening billion-dollar ships with million-dollar weapons. Drones are doing the same thing to ground forces, making expensive platforms and force concentrations vulnerable to cheap, mass-produced weapons. Every Russian soldier killed by a Ukrainian drone represents not just a number, but also lost combat experience. Some Russian casualties are fresh recruits with minimal training. Others have months of frontline experience and specialized knowledge. When a drone strike kills an experienced Russian squad leader or tank commander, that knowledge disappears. The replacements flowing in from training centers don't have the same level of competence. This creates a vicious cycle of declining capability. Inexperienced replacements are more likely to make fatal mistakes, leading to higher casualty rates, which in turn require more replacements. Ukrainian forces exploit this by targeting Russian command elements and experienced units specifically. The drone wall that Ukraine has established doesn't just cause casualties, it systematically degrades the quality of Russian forces by killing experienced soldiers and forcing less capable replacements into positions they're not ready to handle. Training quality has also declined as Russia struggles to process the volume of recruits needed to sustain operations. Pre-invasion training programs that might have lasted months are now compressed to weeks. Contract soldiers are receiving cash incentives to join quickly and deploy to Ukraine with minimal preparation. Some reports indicate that convict recruits receive even less training before being sent to frontline Storm Z units, where their life expectancy is measured in weeks. The contrast with Ukrainian forces is stark. While Ukrainian units rotate to rear areas for rest and training between deployments, Russian units are often kept on the line continuously until they're rendered combat ineffective through casualties. When Russian units do rotate out, the personnel gaps are filled with individual replacements rather than intact trained teams. This makes unit cohesion, one of the most important factors in combat effectiveness, extremely difficult to maintain. Looking ahead to 2026, Russia faces a fundamental strategic problem that cannot be solved through incremental adjustments. The country's military math requires that incoming personnel exceed losses for offensive operations to continue. With recruitment around 30 to 35,000 per month and combat losses potentially matching or exceeding this figure, Russia cannot expand its force size in Ukraine. At best, it can maintain current numbers. At worst, even that becomes impossible if casualties continue to rise while recruitment plateaus. ISW analysis from late 2025 assessed that Russian forces are currently unable to build out a strategic reserve. Every available soldier is needed to replace losses in active sectors, leaving no pool of troops available for new offensives or to exploit breakthroughs if they occur. This means that Russian forces will likely remain constrained to grinding slow advances at their current rate and scale rather than achieving any dramatic operational successes. For Ukraine, this creates an opportunity if Western support continues. Ukrainian military planners have set a goal of inflicting 50,000 to 60,000 Russian casualties per month through drone strikes in 2026. General Syrskyi wants Ukraine's unmanned systems forces to reach this level of effectiveness. If achieved, this would mean Russia's recruitment cannot keep pace with losses, and the size of Russian forces in Ukraine would begin to shrink. Russia is exploring alternatives to maintain force levels. Changes to conscription laws have raised the draft age and tightened controls over compliance. There's speculation that Moscow may eventually allow older conscripts to be sent to frontline areas, essentially circumventing the distinction between contract soldiers and draftees. However, any move toward forced mobilization would be politically risky for President Putin, given the backlash to the September 2022 partial mobilization that led to protests and an exodus of fighting-age men from Russia. Russian state media continues to present the war as proceeding according to plan, with President Putin claiming that Russian forces are advancing all along the line and can increase the pace at will. The reality visible in casualty data and territorial gains tells a different story. The contrast between propaganda claims and battlefield results creates cognitive dissonance that even Russian citizens are beginning to notice. The Kremlin continues to classify exact casualty figures as state secrets, with the last official Russian casualty announcement coming in September 2022, when the Defense Ministry confirmed 5,937 deaths. Given that independent verification has since confirmed over 152,000 Russian deaths by name, the gap between official claims and reality is enormous. Russian citizens looking for information about relatives who went missing in Ukraine have submitted over 50,000 inquiries through Ukraine's I Want to Find project, highlighting how many Russian families lack information about their loved ones' fates. This information control is becoming harder to maintain. Social media platforms, despite censorship, carry videos of Ukrainian drone strikes. Russian military bloggers, while generally pro-war, have become increasingly critical of command decisions that lead to high casualties for minimal gains. The November 2025 Russian military blogosphere saw widespread criticism of operations around Kupiansk, where Russian forces suffered heavy losses without achieving objectives. Such public criticism, even from pro-Russian sources, suggests eroding confidence in military leadership. International observers and intelligence agencies provide their own casualty estimates that contradict Russian claims. British intelligence, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Institute for the Study of War, and other credible sources all publish analysis showing Russian losses at levels far exceeding anything the Kremlin admits. This creates a situation where the global understanding of the war's trajectory differs sharply from the narrative Russian citizens receive through state media. While this analysis focuses on military casualties, the human cost extends far beyond soldiers. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission documented that civilian casualties in Ukraine increased sharply in 2025. The total reached at least 2,514 killed and 12,142 injured, a 31% increase compared to 2024. The use of long-range weapons by Russian forces exposed civilians across Ukraine to heightened risk, not just in frontline areas. The same drone technologies causing military casualties also threaten civilians. UN monitors documented that short-range drone attacks killed 395 civilians and injured 2,635 between February 2022 and April 2025. These attacks targeted civilians in cars, buses, humanitarian workers, and even marked ambulances. The vast majority occurred in Ukrainian-controlled territory from Russian attacks. Civilian casualties from short-range drones increased by 120% in 2025 compared to 2024. The indiscriminate use of drones against civilians raises serious questions under international humanitarian law. While drones offer precision, using them to target non-combatants violates fundamental principles of distinction between military and civilian targets. The UN report specifically documented Russian forces using drones to hunt civilians engaged in normal activities, driving to work, taking buses, or providing humanitarian aid in frontline areas. This systematic pattern suggests deliberate targeting rather than accidental strikes. Russia's attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure continued throughout 2025, with October seeing a resumption of large-scale coordinated strikes on power facilities nationwide. These attacks created prolonged power outages affecting millions of civilians, particularly during winter months when electricity is needed for heating. By fall 2025, Ukraine's energy infrastructure was operating at only about one-third of its pre-invasion generation capacity. The humanitarian impact of these infrastructure attacks compounds the direct casualties, creating conditions that endanger civilian health and survival. The battlefield evidence from 2025 tells an unambiguous story. Russia's military strategy is not working. The country is losing soldiers at an unprecedented rate while gaining territory at a glacial pace. Drone technology has fundamentally altered the military balance, giving Ukraine a force multiplier that partially offsets Russia's numerical advantage. Most critically, Russia has reached a point where its monthly recruitment barely matches its monthly losses, making further offensive operations unsustainable. For nearly 3 years, analysts have debated whether Russia's larger population and resources would inevitably lead to Ukrainian exhaustion. The evidence from 2025 suggests otherwise. Ukraine's technological adaptation through mass drone deployment has created a new kind of warfare where numbers matter less than precision and where expensive equipment and massed formations have become liabilities rather than assets. The soldiers Russia continues to send to Ukraine face a battlefield dominated by weapons that were barely relevant 5 years ago but are now the primary cause of casualties. The coming months will test whether this new military reality forces a change in Russian strategy. Can Moscow continue mobilization at current rates while offering ever larger financial incentives? Will the Russian economy sustain both military production and recruitment costs? Can Russian forces adapt tactically to reduce their vulnerability to drones? Or will the mathematical reality that losses exceed replacements eventually force a strategic reassessment? What's clear is that the assumptions underlying Russia's invasion have proven false. The war hasn't been short. Ukrainian resistance hasn't collapsed, and the military math that was supposed to guarantee Russian victory has instead produced the highest casualty rates for any major power since World War II. The drones circling over Ukrainian battlefields have rewritten the rules of modern warfare, and Russia is paying an extraordinary price for failing to adapt fast enough. If you want to stay informed about these developments as they unfold, subscribe to Sophie Hart Reports. Leave a comment below with your analysis of how this war might end. Share this video with anyone interested in understanding modern military strategy. The story of how small, cheap drones helped Ukraine resist one of the world's largest militaries is still being written, and the implications will shape military planning for decades to come. The question now is whether Russia can continue fighting a war where the battlefield mathematics have turned decisively against it.